to Beyond the Ring, a podcast that covers all things in the stock show industry from the informative to the insane. Starring Ryan Rash.
I didn't come to crash the party. I came to end it.
And Dale Hummel.
It is time to break out and see the world.
Now on with the show.
Welcome to Beyond the Ring. I am Dale Hummel, alongside co-star Ryan Rash.
Hello, hello, hello.
Ryan, we have a special guest today that has made a request to come on during the current events, and I'm sure he'll be able to add to that. And that would be Blaine Rodgers, owner and operator of Rodgers Livestock and gainfully employed by SureChamp. Blaine, we're happy to have you today.
Thanks, guys. Glad to be on.
Ryan, what is taking place in the world? I'm a little bit isolated and out of touch, so I would love for you to share whatever current events you think need addressed.
Well, that is because you decided to take a trip to Florida with your family and go on vacation, and evidently they don't have the news down there. They just have black tip reef sharks. But before we get into the current event,
that is incorrect. You are incorrect.
I am not incorrect. I am seldom wrong and never.
I am in Alabama.
Seldom wrong. And
okay.
I thought you were in quarantine.
Pretty much.
I was in quarantine, yes.
But I do want the listeners to know that when Brave Dale made this trek.
Ryan, there's some things we don't talk about. Did we discuss that earlier?
Y'all have already censored me enough on this episode before we started, so I am going to get this out. So, we get these texts, Blaine's in this text, because we always have a little group text before we record, and so Dale informs us that while he is on the plane, that a gentleman 2 rows in front of him began to get sick on the plane, and literally Dale has a nuclear-sized meltdown, according to his lovely wife, Holly, and his daughter, Tara.
Now, I am sure you have to be exaggerating. And by the way, in my defense, how many times you fly all the time? I fly a lot. Blaine flies a lot. How many people have you seen get sick on a plane? I know we have the barf bags in the seats, but how many people have you ever seen use one?
I have never seen it happen before, but I am going to tell you this much, Dale Hummel. Because of all your overreacting of everything, Miss Rona, this is what they say, karma is a bitch.
It was not a pleasant experience, and my family did not seem in the least bit concerned about this gentleman. The flight attendant comes up to him and very much leads him down the path. I believe they're required, I assume, to ask some questions when somebody is ill on the plane. But she comes up to him and says, well, there was a lot of turbulence. I'm sure you're not feeling well from the turbulence. And I'm thinking, time out. This was the smoothest flight, smoothest landing I've ever had. And he says, yep, just the turbulence.
Tara said there was turbulence.
No, there was nothing. This guy has.
So now you're calling your child a liar.
Yes, I'm calling her out. She was mistaken. She must have been sleeping or something. There was zero turbulence. This guy has corona. He has spread it to everybody in that plane, and nobody seems to care.
Well, you could have been like the guy in my airport and had the full-blown-on hazmat suit, 3 masks, and a sneeze guard, and you would have been fine.
At that point, when that guy was getting sick, I would have taken any hazmat suit there was anywhere in the area.
Oh.
But you weren't worried about it.
I was not worried about the flight prior to. I was doing very well until this gentleman decided that he was not feeling well. And who gets on a plane that feels at this point in time that's sick? Why? I don't understand.
When you landed at your layover, I got a news flash from Fox News on my phone that said the newly stocked Dallas-Fort Worth airport with disinfectant had now completely been out of stock. And I heard you were running around the airport squirting Lysol on everybody.
I had disinfectant. We were good. I had to.
You literally almost dislocated your wife's shoulder trying to get it out of her purse before you ever got off the plane.
I did request that we maybe want to use a little bit of that, yes. But and then I have my daughters that are sitting direct behind this guy, standing up, putting their hands on his back of his seat. No big deal. It's all fine.
Hey, at least he wasn't behind you.
Correct. Maybe I would have never known. I don't know. It was going very well until then. I'm over it. I'm okay. I did hear that the numbers are spiking in Florida, and we're a couple miles away from Florida. We have to go back to Florida to get into an airport. But at this point, it's family vacation time, and I'm calm. I'll be all right.
You sound the most calm. But anyhow. Moving on to current events, you're talking about all this spiking in numbers and all this nonsense. I'm just going to lay this out here for since Memorial Day, we've had 8,000,000 people standing shoulder to shoulder, no mask, protesting, rioting, looting, whatever. And since that's kind of died down a little bit, now they're worried about Corona again. That happens to coincide with the fact that Trump is going to have a rally this week. Just saying.
And it also happens to be back on Corona is spreading because we have some opening up of businesses and people's lives versus protesting.
I mean, I am done with all things Corona. I have flown all over. I have seen people like you, Dale, who are having a heart attack. I'm going to go back to the fact that you need to go out and live your life and take the risk you want to do, just like you did before. Some people drive 95 miles down a highway. Some people drive 55. This is the same principle and concept. Pick and choose your poison, people.
I think that's a perfect analyzation, and you are correct. And we are opening up as a country, even though there seems to be a great deal of pressure to shut things back down. And I don't know if it's because we're running more COVID tests. I tend to look at the hospital numbers more, but I am questioning sometimes the sources that are providing those numbers. But it is simple. Just as Ryan stated, you take whatever chances. And I was as extreme as anybody in the beginning, not knowing what COVID-19 was, not having the information to analyze. And I've gone to the point where I was very comfortable taking a vacation until the little plane incident. But I am back there, and we are out at restaurants. There's Gulf Shores, Alabama, and I hope I'm not getting anybody in trouble. It is 99% open. I mean, there are very few restrictions on anything, very few masks, very few anything going on COVID-19 related. I don't know if that's ideal, but each person can make that choice. Okay, do you want to go on a vacation and put yourself in that position? Do you want to be locked down? Are you a person that maybe is more susceptible to COVID-19? Take those independent decisions or independent choices and make your decisions off of what you feel comfortable with and move forward. And it's time. We have no choice.
I think that the cure is you got to become conservative, because it doesn't affect conservative people near as much.
I have to agree with Blaine. As long as you're a Republican, you seem fine with it.
There is a lot of that going on.
The one thing that I do want to ask Dale is, I know how tight you are and that you don't believe in hotels that, have rooms on the insides because they cost too much and all this other stuff. So how did you feel about paying for that extra bag just full of masks and sanitary equipment that you had to check on the plane to get to Florida?
That is not accurate. There was some sanitation, hand sanitizer. There was that's all that we really brought. Oh, wipes. We brought some Lysol wipes, but those were distributed from between all the suitcases. It didn't take an extra suitcase. However, we were about 5 pounds over, and I had to move the Germex from one suitcase to another to not go for the weight.
Oh, so
are you done? Are you done having fun with me yet?
Not yet. But anyway, we'll move on. So, Dale, before you went to Florida, Alabama, whatever, to go, watch the reef tip sharks mating or whatever you're doing down there, did you happen to notice any of the Seattle tomfoolery?
I did, and it's beyond. I can't explain it. I can't understand how people can be put in that position. And I agree with some of the Fox reporters that it appears to be more of a street party and hang out, do some things maybe that you wouldn't normally be able to do in the middle of the street. And the mayor's okay with it. And not only okay, I don't know the exact negotiations, but I'm sure you can enlighten us, Ryan. But negotiating with people that have taken over a 6 square block portion of the city seems a bit crazy.
Well, they did negotiate yesterday, and they gave a portion of CHOP back to the city of Seattle, but that was primarily only because so that way they could get trucks and emergency vehicles in and out of this new nation that they have formed, so they could be serviced better. I find it really amusing that evidently there is a warlord of CHOP, but he does not want to be identified. He will not come on camera or anything like this. But most importantly, they're real picky about who they let in there with cameras, etc. And so last night on Tucker Carlson, he sent somebody in there. I don't know if it was undercover or what it is, and he's supposedly to have more footage later. But the little highlights that he showed, there's some very interesting people in there. Not only are a great deal of them shown doing drugs and all kinds of other things, but two of them were walking around in like bunny rabbit suits. And most importantly, three of these people that were on this little highlight reel on Tucker Carlson had pissed themselves just walking around the street.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's impressive. That's so this leader, self-proclaimed, I assume,
Warlord,
and is that what we're to refer him as? Warlord.
That is what he wants to be referred to as. Yes,
and assumably the protesters are taking kind of direction from him. It appears to me there's little direction there at all. But
that's who the Warlord is, who did the negotiations with Seattle. Which the one smart thing about all this, I'm going to say, I don't blame Mr. Warlord for not wanting to like come out as the leader if all of his disciples don't know how to use the public restroom. So, I mean, I get that part, but yeah, that's insanity. And I really do not get why they have just not gone in there and like taken all these buffoons out. There was a guy last night that lives in this area that is now CHOP, and he stated on Fox News that he will not walk outside his home after 8 p.m. without a firearm. That's how dangerous it is.
So I think we're missing the point on all this, though. Like, the one thing we've overlooked in all this is that apparently they have figured out how to provide immunity to COVID. Because as soon as you cross that line, this highly contagious disease that no longer quarantined or social distance enforced, it doesn't seem to be affecting anybody in those areas. So maybe there's like some research we could do on these people and what they're doing to figure this whole outbreak out.
And they are definitely not Republicans or conservatives. So your point earlier, Blaine, does not match this right here. Clearly, it is just when it's convenient on the whole Miss Rona nonsense of it all. And it's only going to get worse this week when Trump starts back his rallies. I promise you. And that is the one good bit of news, that he is going to get back out there. He is going to have a rally. He has chosen Oklahoma. And as I have stated, I'm a big fan of Oklahoma, but I think they have done a better job with this than almost any other state in the union. They were the last to close, the first to open back up. And so I'm glad that he chose Oklahoma. And I am also glad that 800,000 people requested a ticket to that rally.
That is impressive on the numbers on that Trump rally. And even though we know Trump does not poll well, it appears as though polls are not in his favor at the moment. But when you have that kind of enthusiasm, those kind of numbers wanting to go to a rally in the middle of COVID-19, and again, the conservative portion of the population is not as concerned about it, it's encouraging. The other point I wanted to bring out with our Seattle issue in giving them a portion of the city, they're obviously one of the cities that's in favor of defunding the police. If the police department is abolished or defunded or whatever, who's ever going to move these people out of the city? Is this a permanent residence that they're allowed to have now?
That's what they're hoping for, yes.
And then that can't happen. I love Seattle. The few times I've been there, it seemed like a nice enough place. I like the wharf area. But it is not, what they're doing in Seattle at the moment doesn't personally affect me at the moment. However, when we start to see things like that established in Seattle, all of a sudden we have other cities and other protesters doing the same thing and taking over portions of the city that include private businesses, that those people that own those businesses have no say in anything. They simply have to succumb to what the protesters and the mayor so chooses they're going to be able to do. It's ridiculous.
Hey, I say we start a GoFundMe and get the people from New Mexico a ticket to Seattle, and they'll handle this real quick.
Tell me about the New Mexico. I've been news absent here for a few days. Please enlighten me.
Go ahead, Blaine.
I thought you were in charge of current events, Ryan.
you really. I thought you liked this one.
Well, I do find it interesting that there's a group of people that have decided that they're going to put their foot down and not allow these protests to escalate. And it'll be interesting to see how this keeps occurring throughout the country. I think there's a certain portion of the population that's fed up with watching the places they live just be turned upside down. And unfortunately, with everything that's gone on, good and bad, the police have been put in handcuffs on what they can do. And it just seems to me like we're going to see some of these extremists start taking matters into their own hand, such as what happened in New Mexico. Hopefully it doesn't continue to spike a lot of violence, but it is a different outlook on how things are being handled for sure.
Basically, in New Mexico, there's a whole bunch of vigilantes that say, screw it, we're not taking it anymore. And that's the PG version, Dale. So you don't censor me. Screw it is the PG version, is what's going on down there.
I'm going to make a prediction here that just like the protest 3-block area of Seattle is going to spread, when we see vigilantes like this, if they have success, guess what? We may see more of that. We're in a mess. It is a mess. No question.
We're literally as close to ever as we've been to a Civil War revolution. I mean, and like I'm not laughing about it. It is absolutely insane, the stuff that's going on right now.
And I'm going to be very biased here, or sound very biased, but a lot of what's going on, in my opinion, is so inflated by some of the media, because we have a presidential election coming up this fall. I'm not sure that these feelings and so forth haven't always been there, but we're bringing so much more attention to it. It's feeding off of itself, and it's taking us down a path that I don't think is a good direction by any means. We all agree on we need to take those bad actors out of the police department that are racist or are crazy and are going to do things that they shouldn't do. There's so many things that need to be changed, but in general, we're talking about fairly isolated incidences, and there's no possible way to make any profession or any business or anything 100% the way everybody wants it. It just can't be done. We need to do all we possibly can do, and it'd be nice if everybody could get behind that and support something that takes us in a much better direction.
Good luck.
I just think that when we become scared to enforce the law because we don't want to step on anyone's personal beliefs, I'm all for people having rights and being treated equal and all of humanity having respect for each other. But our country was formed on a constitution that created law.
Correct. And this law needs enforced across everybody, black, white, purple, gay, straight, doesn't matter. And for some reason, we've lost track of that. And again, if it's weighted one direction or another, we need to fix it. It needs to be equal across the way. And I think everybody agrees on that. Moving on from current events, we're going to go into the topic of the episode, and that's feeding basics. We brought Mr. Blaine Rodgers on to contribute here today, and excited to have Blaine. He and his family have shown across species with as much success at the national level as any family out there. Blaine has an exceptionally strong livestock background. I think has a lot to add to this. His position currently with SureChamp really fits into helping these families maybe do just a little bit better job feeding and covering some of those basics. And I will be happy to go on the record. A lot of times it seems like we have some show families or people in our industry that we sometimes get caught up so much in the detail, we lose track of the big picture. And maybe that's the direction we're going to take this just a little bit today in terms of discussing different feeding management protocols, but it is fairly simplistic if we break it down. With that said, the first one that I want to throw out there, and there's several things that we're going to talk about that relate to digestive health and how that animal performs. Let's talk about the biggest one in my mind. If we are the ones that control feed intake, that then allows us to dictate how that animal is going to perform and grow. I know one position I do not like to be in. If the animal has less than a strong appetite, we're begging them to eat, and then we lose control. If we have an animal with a strong appetite, we can adjust their calorie intake, their protein intake, their fat intake, all of those factors that contribute to that animal going the direction we want it to. But I would much rather be in that position than trying to get that animal or beg that animal to eat. And there are so many factors that come in and affect digestive health and specifically feed intake that we can discuss here. Blaine, I'd love for you to start us off just a little bit with some of your thoughts on the basics, if you would.
You bet. I think that one of the things that that we find a lot of times is that in our industry, it's so competitive and everybody's trying to find the next opportunity to be progressive and gain a little competitive advantage. And so a lot of times we look to the nutrition side of things, and look for the opportunities there. And I'm a big believer that genetics plays a huge role in how livestock will feed, and even in how they consume feed. There's been lots of them that we've had in our barn over the years that just don't like to eat, and there's nothing you can do. You can change things, you can try things to manipulate it, but there's a certain percentage of them that just don't have great appetites. But I agree 100% with you. I think a lot of times that what we do is we try to make it a little too hard, and livestock and their digestive tracts are really pretty basic when you think about how to feed them. And I think that the biggest mistake that we make is try to make it way too complicated. They've got to just be able to perform and utilize their nutrition first to get better and capitalize on the genetics that they have. So, one of the things that we always focus on is keeping them healthy. And there's lots of different ways to go about that. And keeping their digestive tract healthy in that plays a huge role as far as I'm concerned. So, that would be the first thing, is just keeping the basic principles of feeding in task, and trying to keep them healthy so they stay on feed and water, and keep their intake up. One of the things that I've found that we overlook the most is their water consumption. And as we talk about feeding livestock in a couple different stages, I think feeding them at home is one thing, and feeding them on the road as we go to a show is maybe a completely different task at sometimes. But their water intake and providing a clean source of fresh water that's cool is sometimes something that we overlook a little bit. And as we increase their water intake, their metabolism increases and they consume more feed. So I think that's one of the key things that is, as we talk about basics, that's really gets overlooked sometimes, or that we forget about.
Excellent. And I can even take that further. And I appreciate Blaine bringing up this water consumption, because a lot of times when I'll get a phone call from a family or somebody trying to get livestock to eat more, or they just brought a new animal into the barn, oftentimes when we bring that new animal in, it goes off feed or bit, or maybe it's not at the consumption level that we like. And ideally, we'd like to keep them on the same feed they're on prior to that, try not to change that until we get through a transition period. But oftentimes, one thing that's overlooked is just what Blaine's talking about, the water consumption. And when we talk about the direct correlation between water consumption and feed intake, it's one of the first things we should probably look at. We know water is going to be different from well to well, or from town chlorinated water to more country water. It's also going to be different whether that animal is drinking out of a bucket versus an automatic waterer. Lots of different things that can come into play there. Blaine also mentioned when we go to the show, keeping those animals on feed and keeping water intake. We look a little crazy when we pull them to Illinois State Fair with a couple steers, and we'll carry 30 to 55 gallon buckets of water that we brought directly from home, just so we can eliminate any issues with the water that's down there. I know we can put a filter on it, we can do a lot of things, but the less room for error that we leave, and if we can keep those livestock or those show animals drinking, we're much, much more likely to keep them on feed and keep them going the direction that we want to. And the only thing in that last 12 to 24 hours that is legally going to change muscle mass, or the visual perception of muscle mass, is hydration. And I see so often that we're not as concerned about their water intake, sometimes even pulling water from them, which in some situations, maybe because of a way back or something like that, it needs to be done. But in general, think about it. Muscle's 80% water. If we can keep things hydrated, we have larger, more swollen muscle fibers, giving us that impression that these animals are heavier muscled, and more times than not, that's the direction we want to go. So do not pull that water.
Yeah, I think that's very valuable information there, because as we talk about show ring preparation on show day, almost overhydrating them becomes a key area of focus to get them to look 12 o'clock, if you will. And so, obviously keeping that in check. A lot of you may not know, but I spent the first 12 to 13 years of my career once I got done with college, working for a feed mill and helping a lot of kids. And some of the most basic things are overlooked. We had, I'll never forget one situation. We had a kid that kept calling me, and he couldn't get his animals to gain. He'd tell me what he was doing, and they weren't eating good. And simple situation. I went out to his place and we looked at him, and everything looked like it was in check, except that I noticed they had run their water source as a hose over to their water source for this pig, and it was summertime, obviously, and the hose was getting extremely hot. So the water that was coming into his water was very hot that he was drinking, and that animal had just completely stopped consuming water. And so sometimes the point of my story is that we can go through all these elaborate details, buy the best show feed, buy all the supplements in the world, and the one tiny detail is overlooked that causes them to go off feed and water. And so I know it sounds kind of simple, but it is something that we need to take into consideration that way.
Excellent. And Ryan, with your extensive show background as a junior and now helping families, there's a lot of things that we talk about in terms of environmental stresses. And obviously any stress is going to weaken our immune system, maybe throw them off feed a little bit. All the things that we want to happen, we want to try to avoid some of those stresses. What can we do at home? Let's say we have a targeted show of Kansas City or Louisville, and maybe we haven't had the opportunity to take those animals out and show them a lot. Is there anything we can do at home that's going to lessen that transition into those shows?
Well, I think that's probably the biggest challenge that a lot of us are going to face coming up here. If you have a state fair that's happening, or Kansas City, Louisville, not just because my mother runs a junior livestock association, but one of the most beneficial things that I have always found, no matter what species it is, animals are very similar to humans. And so the kids that were out there and played in the dirt and got exposed to a lot of stuff, they don't get sick quite as often as some of these that have been more sheltered. Well, that's kind of the concept of going to a show. I understand that you're going to take your water source from home to the state fair to help ease things out, but it has always just been our belief in the kids that I help, the more different places that you can get that animal to, get them to see more, expose them to more environments, then when you get to that targeted show, then they're going to be more relaxed, more susceptible to, sticking to the routine that they know, and they will have been exposed to a lot more different tastes, sounds, etc. And so the fact that we can't get out there and do that right now as much is a problem. One thing my families have done in the past, in terms of they had one that, was pretty skittish or not quite ready to go to a ring because there's other families and exhibitors involved, you can take those animals to different places. Go to your neighbor's house, go to the sale barn, take them and put them in a different environment. And if you can't go to a show, that's one thing you can do right now is find some other barn or find some other place where you can take that calf, that pig, that goat, lamb for a night, get them exposed to something else, new sights and sounds, so they'll be more relaxed and ready when you get to that final endpoint.
One of the things that I think that we forget a lot of times is most of us live in rural areas, and most of these shows are in, kind of bigger cities or whatever that are on city water. A lot of times there's a lot of chlorine in that water when we get there. And so the livestock may be thirsty, they may be willing to drink, but just the simple taste of it is different. And I know that you said that you haul a lot of water from home, which will obviously help that tremendously. One of the things that we do here and a lot of my customers is we try to add some kind of a flavoring product to it prior to leaving that they get used to. The company I work for has a product called Liquid Boost, and I use that all the time before we head out, and the animals get used to that flavor. Not only do a lot of those products give them electrolytes or prebiotics or things like that in there to help them stay on feed and increase their water and feed intake, but the biggest thing that it does, in my opinion, is that when you get to those shows where there may be chlorine taste in that water, it kind of masks it and it allows them to feel comfortable in drinking that water. So that's one of the things that I really like to do ahead of time, just to get them acclimated, is to make that source consistent by putting that in there at home so they're used to it. And then when you go on the road, no matter if the water is different, it kind of masks it and it makes it more comfortable.
Some of these things seem simple, but as Ryan and Blaine have talked about, And when we talk about those environmental stresses and the changes in water, chlorinated versus non-chlorinated, there's a lot of directions we can go. Use some common sense and take that approach. Don't just assume those animals are going to consume that water at that show. Do what we can. And we talked about, and Ryan brought it up so well, these environmental stresses and trying to acclimate them by going to a neighbor's house or things like that. If you can get those animals out, if we're talking a situation that's possible, maybe we're in the cooler room, we don't want a chance losing that hair or changing that hair cycle, or for whatever reason, sometimes we just can't get out before that targeted show. But Ryan stated so well that if we can get them to a couple shows, 2 or 3 shows prior to that targeted show, they get it. They understand that the smells, the noises, the distractions that may be at a show, and they're much more at ease. And if we can keep these animals much more at ease and comfortable, we're in way better shape. I think another topic when we talk about digestive health and keeping the animal going the right direction in terms of feed intake, that in my opinion is sometimes overlooked, and maybe it's more so because of the situation in the weather goat business, but parasite control. It seems to me that if these animals don't have the screaming shits, we're not real concerned about coccidia. We're maybe not looking at the other parasites as specifically as maybe I would prefer to make sure everything's going the right direction. Even if we have a moderately low load in an animal that we're trying to get 110% of performance out of, I would rather be closer to 0 than what we call an acceptable parasite load. This does not apply to breeding herds. We don't want to develop too much resistance, but when we have that one specific market animal that we're trying to get every bit of performance out of, do whatever we can, any parasite infestation, irregardless of the load, unless it's extremely well, is going to impact that. It may not be something that we can see visually, that they have digestive disruption in terms of the screaming shits or anything like that, but let's at least take that to the vet and get a fecal sample analyzed and decide, okay, here's what parasite we're dealing with. Let's target that with the appropriate medication to eliminate that particular parasite. This all comes back around to that digestive health. If we can maximize digestive health, we maximize intake, we maximize nutrient absorption, we're obviously going to get better performance. And there's, I guess, in the goat industry right now and a little bit into the lamb industry, and I think we even find it into the cattle and pigs to a certain degree, but coccidia seems to either, because we're looking at more fecal samples, kind of like the COVID-19, we're testing more, we're seeing more and more of that, and unfortunately a more resilient coccidia strain that pops up in the given show stock species that maybe we haven't seen before. I know in the South they used to say, well, we're too dry, we don't have this issue. I offer to our clients to bring in as many, or to send me as many parasite fecals as they desire, whether it's from a calf or a lamb or a goat. And it's very rare that we'll run a fecal sample from anywhere in the country on a given species that is 0 on coccidia. Blaine, thoughts on our parasite control?
Well, I agree exactly with what you're saying. And to add to that just a little bit, I think that a lot of times we focus just on the digestive health of what parasites can do. And you watch, obviously, as we talk about the show ring, we spend countless hours on skin and hair and all of that. And we'll spend any amount of money to run a cooler or to put topical hair, dressing or whatever on them to condition their hair and make it as good as they can. And as we watch across species, that's becoming more and more popular. As we talk about growing leg hair on goats and sheep and, the shag on these barrows now that are showing to make them look more rugged, just keeping their skin and hair on point. One of the things that we forget is, a topical application or using a parasite control in those situations has as much to do with it as our nutrition that we can provide from a vitamin and mineral standpoint, or any topical hair products that we want to put on them, or putting them in a cooler or whatever we might do. If we go through all those measures and do all those things and we forget to address the parasite control and they're, they break with mites or mange on them, or if they've start rubbing hair out, everything that we've gone through takes us a giant step back. So we're probably over aggressive on our parasite control in terms of pouring them or giving them an injection to help with that. And one of the things that I think is very key is understanding those products and understanding how to use them in a rotation, to use different products along those lines throughout the duration of your project. And we probably overdo it and try to do it every 30 days, rotate those products around. But just understanding how to use them, consult with your veterinarian or your advisors, your breeders, whoever you're working with, to understand what each one of those does. Some of them available on the market do focus on different parasites or different, whether it's external, internal. And so making sure that you have a cross section of those to get everything covered is very important, in my opinion.
No, I think what Blaine says right there is spot on. He says he's over aggressive whenever I was selling stock or helping kids, etc. I always told him that you've got to be super aggressive on that. And like he said, 30 days was pretty much the standard for us. And I think he brings up a good point in terms of rotating those things out, in terms of what you're using for parasite control. No matter what you give to an animal, to a human, etc., the more that you give that, you're going to build up a little bit of immunity there. And so if you do try different things and do rotate those things out for parasite control, then you're going to be better off. But I don't think he's being over aggressive at all. I think he's right on there because, like he stated, we're going to go through all these measures to do all these things to make sure that hair and skin and all these other things are as good as they can be, when they could actually be better if we just focus more on some simple things like that. That will also help you out more than almost anything else.
This seems almost simplistic or crazy, but as much time and effort as we put into skin and hair care and all the things that are relevant in that show ring to get to that competitive level that we need to, we have to cover these basics, because we can do everything else, and that is going to be of no value if we have one of these basic fundamentals that's out of whack. With that said, mental and physical stimulation. And I've talked about this back when I was teaching in my animal science classes and animal behavior class or animal behavior section. We've oftentimes provided in the livestock industry in general for the physical well-being of animals. We know that if we provide for the physical well-being, those animals are more comfortable, they're going to perform better, irregardless of what the animal rights side of things thinks. It's in the livestock producer's best interest to take care of the well-being of that animal from a physical nature. I think we've covered that very well. I think our animals in the show stock industry, in terms of their physical needs being met, we probably will spend more money on that cooler and in electricity to run it than we would maybe in some of our homes. So we're overkill in making sure that those things are provided for the most part. But one thing that I think is overlooked, and I'd love for Ryan to give his input on this, if we don't allow some form of mental stimulation, are we doing ourselves a disservice? A lot of times we may put an animal in a single pen and not provide any stimulation. Maybe they don't even come out of that pen for exercise or anything. Does this have an impact on how that animal's going to perform?
Absolutely it does. And that animal is just exposed to that pen, that cool room, or even a lot of times, I can't tell you how many times with these kids that I have helped, even that the animal that they're pinned with, when you go to a show and those aren't in the same class, but that's their pin buddy. They, stall with that animal at home. They're in the same trap with them at night, and you take that one off to go show in the ring by itself. And both of those animals get really riled up and they're missing their buddy and they don't like it. And it's really causing a problem. It happens all the time. So yeah, one thing that we've done just for that instance is, because I've seen it so many times, they develop a dependency on that other animal. We try to switch them out as much as possible. And of course, when you're feeding as many as some of these kids do in Texas, you have that ability to do that, you can switch them out, make them around more animals. Again, going to shows, that's going to expose them to a lot more, because, just because you and your family take all the time in the world to make sure that everything's right, there's going to be some people that go to shows that haven't spent as much time, or there are going to be animals that just naturally are a little bit psycho. And until they see things like that and are exposed to that, they're not going to know how to handle that situation the first time. It's going to upset them. It's going to cause them stress. And so I think anything that you can do in terms of just changing it up every once in a while, I'm not talking like every day, but once a month or making them exposed to different things, different animals, then you're going to be better off. I mean, I know a bunch of families that in terms of their goats and sheep and pigs, and it sounds out there and stuff, they'll put stuff in their pens for those things to play with so they just don't get bored all the time. I don't know many people that do that with cattle, but I do know that happens. So the mental side of it is very overlooked a lot of times, and it is something that needs to be addressed and a bigger concern because, as we've said, the competition level is so extremely high no matter where you're going to go, and especially in terms of an endpoint of a state fair or a major show, that any little thing and that inhibits that animal's performance, and whether it's not eating and drinking properly at a show or not going out there and showing as well as they could, it could damn sure cost you a placing.
I think that's so correct. And Ryan, I'm going to take it a step farther, and I haven't discussed this with you or Blaine individually, but I'm a firm believer when we look at cattle, sheep, hogs, and goats, the degree of mental stimulation they need. And I can tell you that when we take a calf from the lot at night into the cooler room and back and forth, there's not a lot there that is stimulating them mentally. The same thing when we're feeding lambs. I don't necessarily see a need or as much of a need. But when it comes to feeding hogs or even feeding a goat, that for some reason I would put on a higher plane of intelligence, that if we don't provide some form of mental and physical stimulation, we start to see them go off feed. We don't do maybe as well as what we would like. And we haven't really talked about it, but group versus single feeding and the pluses and minuses. And I think every animal is different across species, whether we need to feed with a feeding buddy or if they're good to feed on their own. But all of these things come into play, and it's something that we simply have to address. And Blaine, I'm sure you're traveling as much as anybody across the country, showing some of these animals and feeding and advising families. Do you ever address, or do you ever hear these stock show families talking about we need to stimulate them in any manner mentally?
No, I think that's one of the things that really gets overlooked. And I mean, they're social just like we are. We've probably seen as good an example of this as anything watching Ryan in quarantine. Nobody is healthy when they don't get interaction. So it's one of the most simple things that we can do, especially feeding livestock and making a competitive environment for them to get in there and feed. A lot of times, like when we start our livestock on feed at home, I mean, we pin them together in groups just so that there is that competitiveness and there's that social interaction. And it's clearly evident that as we put a couple of them together and they form competition or mental stimulation or whatever you want to talk about, their intake goes up. They tend to gain better. There's a lot of things that show us that those kind of things are important as we manage our livestock. But I think a lot of times it's one of the most overlooked.
Excellent. And we're going to move on to another segment that I think sometimes is misunderstood or we don't look at a lot. And I certainly have some opinions on it. But every time we purchase a bag of show feed, there's a feed tag on it. And legally, it has to be presented in a certain manner in terms of the feed ingredients and how it's listed and the different nutritional levels. And with that, the common things that I hear about are crude protein and fat levels in the feed is what people are usually asking me, where do we need to be on these two? And then secondly, one of the things that I'll look at if it's a feed that I'm not familiar with, I'll want to picture that feed tag just so I can determine what ingredients are in there. And as those ingredients are listed from the most to the least on that tag, it may be disguised as a grain byproduct or grain product. So you don't know specifically, but you can at least get some idea. I'm going to toss it back to Blaine. When we're talking about crude protein levels and fat levels, and we can kind of generalize a little bit here, what are your thoughts? We obviously have different needs for different stages and so forth, but what are some basic guidelines that we can look at?
Well, I think as you talk about different species, it's going to change a lot in how that is looked at. But one of the things that I think that a tag can tell you like you say, there's a lot of what we call tag dressing on there. These companies can legally list all these ingredients on there, and they can do a good job of how they label that so they don't give away their recipe, if you will. So I don't know that looking at the ingredients always gives you the most information. But obviously the guaranteed analysis that does state minimums and maximums of protein, fat, and fiber gives you a lot of ideas as to what your expectations can be out of that feed. And one of the things that in the approach that I've learned, I've had the opportunity over the years to work with some of the very best guys in the country and gals that have fed livestock. And a lot of the approach that I have learned is very, very basic, if you will, in terms of what most people might think it takes to be competitive showing livestock. The one thing that I've learned from all of those people across species and the guys that I think are the most successful and intelligent from a nutritional standpoint in managing livestock is really to feed towards a body type. And on the very basic side of feeding, a lot of times we talk about starters, growers, finishers, and they give life stages, obviously, to give us basic guidelines and how to utilize those. But those feed tags, I think understanding the difference in protein levels, understanding the difference in fiber and fat, and how those look, whether we're talking about the growing stage or the finishing stage, really can help you as much as anything in determining how to manage particular animals. I know, for example, as we talk about pigs, they're probably the fastest of any species to change. They're the ones that their muscle content will be manipulated as fast as anything you'll see from a protein level. And really, as you manage those and try to be successful, a lot of it is just managing their muscle so that it doesn't develop faster than their skeleton or their structure or their growth curve. And it's like that across species, but understanding the difference in protein, fat, and fiber and being able to adjust that, understanding that a heavy muscled animal or an extremely heavy muscled animal probably needs a lower protein level, and managing towards the middle from extremes in body type. I think that is the biggest key in understanding how to successfully get the most out of the animal that you have. And I feel like the best feeders in our country or across our country are also the best evaluators, because they can look and see what they have and decipher that and understand the nutritional components. These feed tags give us some of those parameters so that we understand what we're looking at in managing those. Changing the way their body shape is, understanding that we can change their condition based on energy or fat. So those components that are listed on there become a great tool for us to understand what the feed is. Obviously, there's a lot of complex marketing campaigns and everything, and we name these feeds all these different names to have a way to market it. And a lot of times the feed name or the number or whatever doesn't give us a lot of information. So understanding that a grower feed has, higher protein in it, and a finishing feed probably lowers the protein and increases the energy. Those kind of things can be read on those tags so you can decipher what you're dealing with.
Ryan, do you find a lot of the families that you work with, do they feed for the type of animal or for the stage that animal's in, or is that something that you have to do more of the guidance with, or is it even something that's discussed, or you simply give them, here's how much we're going to feed and here's why we're doing it?
Well, with most of the families that I work with, we're in daily communication multiple times a day in terms of those animals and just other things. And if you feed enough of these, it doesn't matter what species, you're going to find one that's difficult to eat, or one that, as was brought up earlier, eats better with someone else, or one that is fine eating by themselves. And I tell people all the time, and it's simple but true, animals are just like people. They have good days, they have bad days, they have different personalities, and the super successful people are going to figure out what works for that individual animal. And like Blaine said, you do have to feed for different types of the maturity levels and how they're growing, what type of animal you have on feed, if they are super muscular or if they need more muscle. And all of those things are available there for you in terms of reading those feed tags, knowing what protein will do for one, more fiber, more fat. All those things are out there. You just have to do your research and talk to people that are knowledgeable and been in those situations. But I think the most important thing that I was always taught, and what I have tried to share with those families, is to get the maximum amount out of that individual animal, you really have to cater to it specifically. And I had a family for over 10 years that, between their heifers and steers, most years they'd have 30 something on feed. And yeah, when you are catering to each and every animal differently, yeah, it's hard to do. But they were extremely successful because they found a way to do just that. And all of those feeds that are out there right now, even though the majority of it is all fairly similar in terms of, the feed tags and what they're made up and comprised of. I think the biggest thing that gets overlooked time and time again in terms of feed is the best thing you can do is go with which feed you can get the freshest all the time. And I know that sounds simple and dumb, but I promise you, all of those feeds out there are really, really good. And they have all worked for different people. The feed that you can get the freshest all the time is 99 times out of 100 going to work the best for you and your operation.
And I think that takes right back to what we talked about before, that fresh feed stimulates intake. It doesn't matter. And Blaine had referred to if we have an animal that maybe needs more or less protein. Let's use an example that we're trying to build muscle on an animal. We're in an intense workout program where we're trying to actually tear the muscle fibers and rebuild those muscle fibers. We need the proper amount and balance of amino acids or crude protein there. And that I want to take a little side note. Be careful because luckily most of our show feed companies out there are covering this for us. But just because that feed tag says it has 18% crude protein, that means nothing more than if we were to take a sample of that feed, chemically digest that sample, determine the amount of nitrogen, and then take that times 6.25 gives us a crude protein value. It tells us nothing if it's all coming from one or two amino acids or if we actually have the proper balance. We're only as strong in that crude protein value as the weakest link of those amino acids. So be a little bit cautious of that. But if we're trying to tear muscle fibers and rebuild an exercise program, we obviously want to feed a higher protein feed. Make sure that is digestible protein that is biologically available. All of those type of things that need to come into play. And hopefully they do just that. And I think when Ryan talks about this fresh feed, I am absolutely 100% in agreement that we have a lot of good feeds out there and a lot of different options. When somebody calls me up that just bought a goat from me and they're in southern Louisiana, they say, well, what do you want us to feed? And my first question to them is, what do you have available that we can get on a regular basis that's fresh and not sitting around in the feed store? Think about crude protein at 18%. If that pig or lamb or goat or whatever we're talking about only eats a small portion of that, it really doesn't matter. Maybe we should look at total intake of crude protein rather than what the percentage is. If we feed an animal 9% crude protein versus 18% and he eats 3 times more of it, guess what? He has more available amino acids to absorb and to work with. So palatability, feed intake, freshness, all of those things. And I'm so glad that Ryan brought it up because it's absolutely, absolutely critical. One thing I'd like to throw out to Blaine, and on the pig side, I see it more than not. When we have pigs and we want to put some more fat on them, and we'll make it as simple as we can, more body condition, more bloom to stouten them up a little bit. Or if we want to get that pig and we think he's just too lean or she's too lean to hit the ring right now, I see so often that when it's time to try to get more fat laid down on these animals, we start bumping the fat supplements to crazy levels. What are your thoughts about just dumping the fat in that feeder, Blaine, to try to, in theory, convert that to fat on the hog?
Well, I think there's a couple things that are confused a little bit. And a lot of times when we talk about body condition, we automatically go to fat sources where, energy or carbohydrates has just as much to do with that. And it's actually a safer way sometimes to get them to change their condition. One of the things that I think that people forget is one of the most effective ways to hold an animal is to increase their fat levels. And I always use the analogy, it's kind of like eating dessert. You can go eat carrot cake and you can eat 15 pieces of it. You try to eat cheesecake and you can eat 1 or 2. And what happens is you limit the ability of the animal to consume by increasing fat level. So one of the things that I think that we forget a lot of times is as we start throwing fat at them, they actually back up on how much their intake is initially. So there's a lot of things that we can manipulate from that regard, utilizing fat. The other thing that can happen, I think, that I see a lot of times when we use a lot of fat, their digestive system isn't always built to handle that. And you kind of increase the levels of ulcers or things of that nature that can, be a negative effect. And I'm not saying that we don't use fat, because we do, but I think there's a threshold that you've got to be very, very careful of. And And I think as we talk about supplements as a whole, and I'm sure we're going to go down this road, I don't want to get off on a tangent right yet, but supplements are meant to be designed to do that, just supplement a small portion of their intake or adjust how those feeds that we're feeding already look slightly. The biggest mistake that I see made all the time is that you go to some people's places and their supplement list in terms of the percentage of the ration they're feeding is larger than the base feed that they were initially feeding. And those are all formulated to be balanced as we talk about that base feed or that show feed that we're using. They're balanced by nutritionists that know and make a living and are professionals and understand the ins and outs. The more we can rely on that information that they have and we don't kind of make it a backyard science project, I think the more successful we can be. I'm the biggest advocate of feeding fat or other supplements, if you will, if it's done in the right intention. But the minute that we get that out of balance, we can create more of a problem for the livestock that we're feeding, and we're going to go backwards on what we're trying to accomplish.
That is exactly where I'm at, Blaine, and that analogy is perfect. And I, when oftentimes asked what fat level do you want, when they tell me a fat level on a feed tag, I'm more concerned about not getting it too high than having it high enough. And if we simply look at the basics and we want to get total calories into that animal, excess calories in an animal is then converted metabolically to fat. And it's more about just energy from carbohydrates and all the sources, the combined sources that's palatable to that animal to bump calories above what their maintenance and growth requirements are. Then they start laying down fat. And that is exactly right. Fat can be a useful tool, but everything in somewhat of a moderation. And I think that does take us into the direction that maybe we need to talk a little bit about feed supplements and what role they play. And I think Blaine has really hit the target there in terms of they are just that. They're supplements, and let's not get things out of whack. And a general rule of thumb, and I can promise you that many people out there feeding hogs break this on a daily basis. Supplements should never be over 20% of the diet. If we get over 20% of that diet, that means that those supplements have to have been formulated on a calcium phosphorus ratio and in many aspects to be able to blend into that feed and make it happen. And that's pretty unlikely. Ryan, what in your experiences in the cattle side of things, where do you come in? Are you feeding every supplement in the world? Are you sticking to the basics? What's your thoughts on it?
Oh, this is not going to be real popular, so that's okay. I guess for me, I think that there are a lot of supplement companies out there that they offer a lot of products that do work very well. There is not one single supplement on the market that I feed regardless of, anything. I just never found one like that I thought needed to be required in every single show animal's diet that I had or one of my feeders had on feed. And so I do use supplements, but I have not found one that I'm going to use on every single animal out there. I think supplements are kind of like, lots of things in this world that has to be targeted and correct for that individual and what you're trying to get done there. Think about bodybuilders and people in that sport. They're not all on the same stuff and they don't all use the same tricks. And that's kind of how I feel in terms of supplements. Again, I'm not anti-supplement. I do use them, but I get to know that animal and what that one is lacking or what that one needs, what needs to be enhanced, etc. on that particular individual and feed specifically for that given animal there. And so that's kind of my take on supplements. I do think they work. I do think they are beneficial. I do think way too many people just say, no matter what, I'm going to feed X, Y, and Z because that's what I've been told and that's what the people that are winning are doing. And so that's what I'm going to do. And so I'm not that person. And that's just kind of my take on it.
And Blaine, you've already given us a little bit of an introduction there. Where are your thoughts and just general, and then we can break it down a little bit between ruminant and non-ruminant on some of these supplements?
I think that one of the things that just goes into feeding any livestock is your overall philosophy. And one of the things of getting the opportunity to be in the nutrition world right out of college, and I didn't have the most extensive background myself showing livestock growing up. It was very basic, started from a 4-H and FFA project that my family had no involvement in agriculture. So I've had to research a lot and learn a lot because I didn't grow up in that environment. And I was able to be around a lot of people that had a lot of different philosophies and were very educated. And one of the things that I've formed an opinion on is when you go to feeding livestock, there's a couple different components that come in. First, you've got to you need to research the information that's available. Find somebody that you believe in their approach or their management style. And then you've got to feed with conviction and you've got to feed with consistency. And those are probably the two biggest areas that I see people take the wrong approach on, just helping them or being in the field and watching what goes on. And when I say feed with conviction, I mean, you've got to come up with a program that you feel that works. Ryan made a great point earlier that, all these feed companies, if you will, for the most part, they have the same science. They have the same opportunity to formulate feeds. There's nothing that's a complete secret out there or cutting edge technology that nobody else has. So for the most part, while there's difference in formulations and ingredients and those kind of things, I mean, for the most part, it's all the same technology. So his point about finding a feed that is consistent in your area and works for you, I think is great. But the biggest problem with all this is that a lot of people don't have conviction in what they're doing and they bounce around to every idea. They get on forums on the internet and see some new supplement or what have you, and they're jumping around and their consistency of their feed program completely goes out the window. I'm a little bit with Ryan. Like, we don't have a million different supplements in our barn or the customers that I work with. I really feel that there's a lot of different areas that you can utilize them. And some animals that we've had win big shows haven't been on hardly any supplements. Some have been on a lot of them. It all just depends on the specific individual and how you need to manipulate that. A lot of times, more often than not, we use supplements to help our window of opportunity. If we've got a pig or a steer or a sheep or whatever that's heavy that needs to go to a show that we're a few weeks off on our endpoint, you can adjust your target just a little bit more by utilizing them. But it's very rarely do any of them, or we never use supplements at an early stage in the livestock when we bring into our barn. We let them grow. We let them take the nutrition from the feed that we're feeding. We keep it pretty basic and keep them healthy and go forward. The one supplement that I do use all the time across species or the type of supplement is usually something that works in with their digestive health standpoint. And I believe that of all the supplements out there, the products that allow an opportunity to increase digestion, intake, and therefore absorption obviously will help everything across the board. It'll help the feed that you're feeding. It'll help the supplements that you may utilize. And so we use one daily in our barn to help in terms of their vitamin mineral intake, a prebiotic or probiotic yeast cultures, those kind of things to keep their digestive tract healthy. And we do it for multiple reasons. One, to capitalize on the feeds that we're purchasing and allow the intake and absorption of those feeds into their system to be better. The other thing that I'm a firm believer in is that there's a lot of research that shows that over 70% of their immune function starts in their digestive tract. So if we keep their digestive tract healthy, especially nowadays with all the VFDs and being limited on feed through antibiotics and things of that nature that have helped us as tools in the past to keep our animals healthy and on feed, if we can create a healthy environment in their gut that helps, as a result, increase their immune response, it really becomes something that's advantageous. So there's lots of different supplements that you can use to manipulate muscle or fat or fill or hair or structure or any of those kind of things slightly. The one thing that we're pretty consistent on is addressing their gut health initially so that all those components that we feed can reach their maximum potential that way.
Blaine, that's as good of discussion and analogy on supplements, and particularly I appreciate you bringing up digestive health, because if there's one thing that we will consistently recommend or use, anything that's going to be vitamin mineral based or possibly a yeast based supplement that's going to improve that digestive health, in turn improve that immune system, that's when we can start saying, okay, it truly does help the skin and hair coat. It truly does help muscle development. Anything that can increase palatability, increase digestion, and specifically increase absorption rate lends itself to lots and lots of positive things. With that said, I'm going to probably be less popular when I talk about any of the other supplements that are not necessarily vitamin or yeast or even mineral based. And there are supplements we use, and depending on the animal and what it needs, there's no question that I am not anti-supplement, but there are supplements on the market that in my mind are not maybe as science-based as they need to be. And when a specific supplement claims that they can do everything, kind of like what Ryan alluded to earlier, I'm not buying into it. It is not biologically possible to feed a product that's going to pull fat off of one certain area of the body and maybe deposit on another area, or even pull it off that particular area and not elsewhere. It just doesn't biologically work that way. We can't target muscle on one specific spot. In other words, I've seen diagrams of different parts of a beef steer broken up into here's something that we can feed this supplement to increase mass here, feed this supplement will take fat away from here. I'm calling bullshit on most of that. It just, we can't do that. We're going to, for the most part, biologically deposit fat as that animal was designed to deposit fat. And the same with muscle. Can we work different muscle groups like a bodybuilder and really focus on those groups and increase mass in certain areas? Absolutely. But I am confident we can't feed a specific supplement that's going to target those exact areas. Can we feed a supplement that may take fat off the entire body? Sure, we can. Can we feed an amino acid-based supplement that if we're tearing muscle fibers may allow them to repair themselves and become bigger each time we tear down and rebuild? Absolutely. Those things work. So my caution to the wind is be careful. Make sure that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And the only supplements out there that can say, okay, we're going to improve performance, we're going to improve hair coat, skin coat, are ones that are designed to help the digestive system, help that immune system. And in turn, those are some of the side effects or the benefits that we're going to see from that. So use some common sense. Do not assume that because a supplement's extremely high price that it's going to absolutely work. And I am confident there's a lot of champions in the market shows, even breeding shows across the country, that are being fed specific supplements that may be expensive even, that we think, well, they were fed that, we better do that. Well, guess what? A lot of times it's not necessarily that one supplement, but think about what we've talked about. All the fundamentals are being covered, and that family that had that champion, wherever it may have had that same champion with or without the supplement. Maybe it's the fact that we're doing everything else right. We can even talk about joint health. And I think glucosamine has been fairly popular across species. We even see it on the human side. So look at it that way. Does that maybe help a little bit in terms of our structural soundness and longevity? Maybe. I think there's a little bit of science to that. But more times than not, if that feed ration is not lacking, let's say in an amino acid, if it's not lacking in vitamins or minerals, some of those supplements maybe aren't going to be as effective as they should be. But if you focus on digestive health, you focus on building that immune system, there's where we see some of those benefits. So I am cautious and oftentimes asked by clients of ours once they're a new family and they're asking, well, what supplements do you use? And I'll give them a list of a handful of supplements, but oftentimes or more times than not, when I go back to the basics that we've talked about right here, the fresh water, making sure that we have a fresh, balanced feed ration, irregardless of what brand it is, doing those fundamentals are far more important. And even when we get to the shows on the goat side of things, more times than not, if we're allowed to drench at those shows, guess what's in that drench gun? It's simply water. And if we can get enough water into them, we're going to get to what Blaine talked about, a super hydration or a maximum hydration. Will electrolytes help pull it in? Sure. Anytime we have glucose in the system, we're going to be able to pull more water into the muscle or maximize the amount that's going to be pulled in. So we can look at those things and it is positive. And I think there's a lot of good in some of those supplements, but be cautious. Just because they make a claim, it isn't always going to maybe be quite as positive as what you think. And I get very, very fearful. And I'm going to take this down another direction on the swine side of things. And Blaine's going to be the expert in this field. But when I walk through the swine barn and I see a cart sitting next to the pen that has 12 different supplement buckets in it, and then one bucket or half a bucket full of just pig feed, show feed. Blaine explained it earlier. If we get that calcium phosphorus ratio out of whack, if we start going too far one direction because of a certain supplement, even the addition of that one extra cup of fat, all of a sudden we're probably self-defeating because we're not going to get the intake that we'd like to have, or we're not going to biologically allow that animal to digest and absorb those nutrients because we have something so far out of whack. And I'm not trying to pick on the swine industry, and I know a lot of people that feed a lot of supplements have tremendous success, but I do want to throw caution to the wind. Let's be careful. If you have faith in that feed that you're using, it's a truly a balanced ration. The more supplements we dump into that feed, the more likely we are to move that out of that acceptable range into a range that may cause issues. Blaine, Ryan, any comments on supplements? Any further comments, I should say?
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about as we're talking about some of this stuff, and Ryan brought up the fact that he's very leery of any supplement that's like the silver bullet that catches everything. And one of the things that I've learned is I've had the opportunity to work with some of these companies on the nutrition side and help in terms of formulating some of these supplements. One of the first things to be very conscious of is that if a supplement's making a claim that it does multiple different things, it is physically impossible to formulate a condensed supplement that has all these different ingredients in it to accomplish all these different tasks. There's just not enough room in that supplement to do that. So the second they make claims that it can change muscle content and fat content and hair and all these different things and make it sound like there's one supplement that catches all, it is absolutely physically impossible to be able to make a supplement that way in a condensed version. So I think the second that we see some of those claims being made is one of the first times that we need to kind of maybe be aware that there's maybe not 100% legitimacy to what they're doing. The other thing about the supplement feeding is that I think, the best advice we can give anybody is to just keep things simple. The more complex you make it, the chances are the more out of balance our feeding programs are getting. And so while these supplements have a great opportunity, and maybe this summer more than ever, where endpoints are changing and going in different directions as the shows get extended and we're looking at some schedule changes, there's going to be times where these supplements become key, but it's very important to make a plan and execute it utilizing the ones that are targeted for that specific need and not throw the kitchen sink at them.
I think Blaine makes an excellent point, as he has the whole time. And it is really refreshing for me to hear him have so much common sense about this. Even though he works for a feeding company and makes supplements, he's still really got a good grasp on what needs to happen and how these livestock feeders need to go about that. And I think that says not only a lot just for him, but also the company that he works for. But on that point, throwing the kitchen sink at things and getting them out of whack in terms of too many supplements, like Dale and Blaine both said, I'm just going to share a funny story with you. Early 2000s, we were at the State Fair of Texas and had a steer there, and he went on to be the grand champion steer at the show. Well, there was a gentleman that stalled across from us all week, and I never met him before, but that steer ends up winning, and all we had literally fed this calf all week was feed and water. And this was a real unique steer, real special steer. Been to probably 40 different shows, and so he was pretty in tune on how it needed to happen there at a given show. And so he didn't need anything. He didn't need anything other than just feed and water and go that ring. And so when we got done from the backdrop back at the stalls and we're having a little bit of victory celebration, man walked up and he wanted to know what all the supplements and what were all the hocus pocus in making that steer win. And I said, I guess I don't know what you're talking about, sir. He says, well, everybody else on this aisle has been feeding all these different things, and you've just been putting out feed and nothing in that water, and that calf wins. And you're lying to me, and you're not letting us see what you're really feeding that steer. I said, and I've tried to explain to the gentleman that wasn't right, that that we do feed supplements, but this one didn't need anything. He was just that good and didn't have anything that we needed to be tweaked on at the show, etc. And I mean, this dude got angry. Like, I was holding back information from him that he had to have in order for his kids to be successful. And like, it got to the point that I thought that we were fixing to get into a confrontation. And I just kept telling the man, sir, if you want to know what type of supplements that I feed to other cattle or other types of cattle, I'll be glad to have that conversation with you. I said, but I am not lying to you in the fact that this animal right here has not been on any supplements at all within the last 3 months, and very few his whole life. He's just, that's the calf he is. Finally, this one brother of the girl showing had enough and threatened to whip the guy's ass, and it was over. But I mean, there is that mindset out there that you have to feed some type of hocus pocus or magic potion to go on and get up there and to the backdrop and the big banners. And I am not against supplements at all. I think there are a lot of them out there that work for specific reasons and instances. I do not believe there is that one magic powder, dust, etc., that can just fix all things in livestock.
I think Ryan's on board. And I think the hardest thing to manage in feeding livestock is sometimes managing ourselves, especially when you're working on elite ones that genetically and phenotypically can do things on just basic feed. Sometimes the hardest thing is to control yourself and not do more and not overdo things.
Great story, Ryan. Blaine, I appreciate the input there, and it all makes sense. Sometimes we just think we have to do more, and a lot of times if we hit those fundamentals and hit those basics and use some common sense, it all seems to work. Guys, I greatly appreciate the transparency that you have both brought to today's discussion. With that, until next week, I thank both Blaine and Ryan for an excellent episode.
Well, Dale, you have fun there in Alabama or Florida or wherever you're at. Make sure that you give us updates on your plane ride home, and hopefully nobody else gets sick and you don't have to like go into full-blown panic mode on your trip back to the ice state in which you live in. I want to thank Blaine for coming on the show. I really appreciate his opinion on all this and his information, and definitely an educated and well-informed one at that.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me on. It was really fun to get to hear your different perspectives. Really excited about these shows firing back up and getting back out there and being involved with all these young people showing their livestock. Hopefully get to see you guys down the road.